Well, I'm going to get us started, even though people are still logging on. Good morning and welcome to City Club Missoula's December Forum, which we are recording. I'm Susan Hay-Patrick, Chair of the City Club Missoula Board of Directors, and I'm delighted to see so many of you with us here today. City Club's mission is to bring people together to inform and inspire them on issues vital to the community through public forums that encourage the discussion of new ideas and free exchange of thought. We have a deep commitment to civility and civil discourse, but given that today's topic is not really issue-oriented, I will spare you my usual Mary Poppins-like discourse on the importance of civility and civil discourse. Each December, we look for something different than our usual issue-oriented forums, something more in line with the holiday spirit. This seemed especially important in this dumpster fire of a year. Our board had been talking about how we might partner with local nonprofit Tell Us Something, and this forum seemed like the right time to do it, because Tell Us Something inspires understanding, acceptance, and empathy through storytelling. And if there ever were a time when we need understanding, empathy, and acceptance, that time is now. We chose connection as the theme of the forum because, again, now is a time when it is so important to stay connected. Physically distanced, but socially and emotionally connected. Before I introduce Mark Moss with Tell Us Something, some thank yous, as always, to the University of Montana and Alex Karklins for making these virtual forums possible. Also, Missoula Community Access Television, which tapes our forum as part of their media grants to nonprofit organizations. MCAT serves the Missoula area on cable channels 189 and 190. You can also find videos of past forums by clicking the video button on our website, cityclubmissoula.com. You'll see our sponsors, many of our sponsors listed here on the slide. We want to thank especially our executive level sponsors, Blackfoot and First Security Bank. We also like to highlight other sponsors every month. So today we want to recognize Garlington Lawn and Robinson, MMW Architects, and one of our nonprofit sponsors, Arts Missoula. We are grateful to our very diverse sponsors and we invite you to join them. And of course, thanks to our board of directors and our administrator, Eric Legvold. The reason we were late getting started is that we had some technical difficulties, which I'm sure are familiar to all of you Zoomers. And two of our storytellers, Molly Bradford and Greg Monroe, who were not prepared to tell their stories live, have agreed to tell their stories live. We were going to show you a videotape of their performances, but we are very proud of them that they, without notice, are going to recreate their stories live, and it's going to be awesome. If you had the pleasure of hearing them live several months ago, you know what I'm talking about. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Mark Moss. Mark is the founder, executive director, organizer, story coach, outreach coordinator, and chief cook and bottle washer of Tell Us Something. So welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Susan. And thank you so much, Greg and Molly, for picking this up so quick. I want to start off by just saying I did some work with MEDA, the Montana Economic Developers Association this year. And Russ Fletcher, who's on the board, sent me this morning. And I don't even know if he realized that I was going to be doing this today. But George P. Schultz is the former United States Secretary of Labor, Treasury, and State, and was the director of the Office of Management and Budget. He worked under the Nixon and Reagan administrations, and on Friday, in the Washington Post, he wrote 5 things that he's learned in his 100 years, and storytelling made that list. And he shares this story about a time that he delivered a speech to, or he provided a speech to Ronald Reagan to review. And he says, on one day as Secretary of State in the Reagan administration, I brought a draft of foreign policy speech to the Oval Office for Reagan to review. He read the speech and said, "That's fine," but then began marking it up. In the margin on one page, he wrote, "Story." I asked what he meant. "That's the most important point," he said. "Adding a relevant story will engage your readers. That way you'll appeal not only to their minds, but to their emotions. Telling a story," he made me understand, "helps you build your case in a way that no abstraction can. A story builds an emotional bond, and emotional bonds build trust." Storytelling really does have the power to reach people on an emotional level, and I believe that when we listen to each other share stories, we change our hearts as storytellers, we're changing ourselves, and we are transcending challenges we've overcome. As listeners, we're changing our hearts and our minds. And if we can change our own hearts and our own minds, we can change our community, and we can go out and we can change the world. And that's what Tell Us Something does. Although if I advertised it that way, nobody would come. I wouldn't go to that. I wouldn't go to that event. It's supposed to be entertaining. And it is. We've been doing this for 10 years. We don't announce who the storytellers are ahead of time. Each storyteller has 10 minutes to share their story on whatever the theme is. Greg and Molly shared their story on, the theme was tipping point that night. And I said that this year I worked with Mita doing some story coaching. And, it was the 10-year anniversary of Tell Us Something. We were going to go on a whirlwind tour of Montana. We were going to go all across the Western Montana to, I think we had 10 different cities planned. And obviously that didn't happen, but after the PPP loans and the SBA grants got out of the way in April, I did some professional development, did some work with the Kennedy Foundation to become a better arts integration teacher through Spark and a program of Arts Missoula. So grateful for that opportunity, and spent some time with Mary Beth Rothwell developing a storytelling intensive workshop for the graduate program Creative Pulse at the University of Montana. I took part of that and morphed it and started doing corporate storytelling workshops over Zoom this year. And one of the participants in the Mita workshop, when I asked her for her testimonial, I was really surprised at what she wrote. And she said, "What was really special about the time spent with my mother-in-law, Arlene, while she was in hospice care was that I had been working on story making with Mark Moss for a work project. My family had been prompted by hospice staff to talk to Arlene even while she was unconscious. This was a way of preparing ourselves and her for the moment of departure. Because of Mark's coaching with words and senses, I was mindful of telling a beautiful story to her. I spoke of joining the family late in life and how I enjoyed some family traits such as fierceness and compassion. I reminded her how I'd be looking out for her brother and her husband, her son and grandchildren, and how much we'd be missing her at milestone moments. I even got my husband, who does not like to write, to also put words about releasing her to her journey and sending her away with gratitude. What followed is that because we had prepared mindfully, we continued to remember to emphasize to her verbally how much we loved her, what a good job she'd done with the hand she'd been dealt, and how we were all looking out for each other in her stead. We also became more transparent with each other about our sadness, anger, irritability, and helplessness. The stories that we were telling her around her bed helped me to compose her obituary, her final story, for all time. Mark's storytelling coaching is terrific for an event, but it also helps a person articulate the specific granularity of a moment, a feeling, or a milestone. It gives a deeper, richer texture to the fabric of our lives. Even though we have been unable to gather in person for storytelling events this year, I've been able to utilize the opportunities of online learning, bringing storytelling around the state of Montana. My real joy, though, is the live events, and didn't realize today would be that much of a live event, but it's about to be. And want to introduce to you our first storyteller, Greg Monroe. Greg is the father of 2 adopted daughters who are now adults with children of their own. A long career as a trial lawyer, including 30 years as a law professor at the University of Montana, Greg Monroe has made storytelling the core of his advocacy. and is awed by this ancient and beautiful communication. In his story, Greg, along with his wife, embarks on an adoption journey that results in the very first open adoption in the state of Montana. Greg calls his story the tipping point for secrecy in infant adoptions. Greg's story, he told it live on stage at the Wilma last year, December 10th, to a sold-out crowd. Greg?
Thanks, Mark. I want to tell you, I have a juvenile need to be with people, and I really regret that I can't be there and meet all of you today. Many of you I know already. In the early 1980s, my then wife and I, Lynn Anderson, were going through the emotional disruption of not being able to get pregnant. And we elected to go to Catholic Social Services, the major adoption agency in Montana. Now, adoption back at that time, and this is the early 80s, was still very traditional, and it was veiled in secrecy. What that meant was when you adopted, the birth mother, she placed her baby with the agency. She would never know what became of that baby for the rest of her life. And the baby would never know what became of her birth mother for the rest of her life. And we would never know the birth mother. So we entered that process, and we were advised of that secrecy and how it was going to go. And we went through the process, and it was a great learning experience. And then at some point, the adoption social worker, Becky, said, well, congratulations, you are expecting. Now, they had asked us, do you want a boy or a girl? And we said, it doesn't matter. We'll take our chances like everybody else. And I was at my desk on a late January afternoon in Billings, and I got a phone call from Becky, the social worker, and she said, we've got a problem. And immediately I was scared to death. And she said, can you come to Helena right now and pick your baby up? And I was shocked. And I said, oh my God, we'll charter a plane. And so I hung that. And so she told me what had happened. The baby had been born a day or two earlier, and the mother, who I'll call Chris, was ready to leave the hospital. And the social worker went to her and said, okay, you're free to go. And she was staying at the Florence Crittenden home in Helena, which was a home for unwed mothers, as they called it. And so she said, you're free to go back to the Florence Crittenden home. And the mother was 15 years old, and she was from Anaconda. And she said, well, what about Jennifer? And that was the crib name for our daughter, Andrea. And the social worker said, oh, we keep her here for a couple of weeks now, and then we'll place her. And this 15-year-old said, what? And she said, why would you keep her here? And they said, well, it's called a cooling off period in case you change your mind. And the 15-year-old said, I'm not going to change my mind. I want the baby placed today. And they talked about it and argued about it. And the social worker finally said, Chris, I've got something I need to tell you. My mother died today in North Dakota, and I need to get to North Dakota to take care of my elderly father. Can we, you go ahead and go today, and I promise that we'll get together next week and we'll place the baby next week. And Chris said, no, absolutely not. And she finally said, this 15-year-old said, if you don't place this baby today, I'm going to take her and leave and parent her myself. And so Becky, the social worker, talked to the higher ups, and they'd never been faced with this situation before. And they decided the only thing to do was call us. And they called us. And so that's how this came about. So I picked up the phone to dial my wife. She was a CPA working across town. And at that very moment, all the power in my part of Billings went out. So I jumped in the car and drove over to her office and ran in and said, I'm going to get very emotional. Ran in and said, our baby's here. And she and I ran up to the St. Vincent's Hospital. They had free baby seats. And to land, we borrowed a baby seat. We caught a Frontier Airlines flight right at that moment. Something would be impossible today. And we flew to Helena. And when we got to Helena, we had agreed with the social worker to meet at a local restaurant right by the airport. And when we got there, she and the 50-year-old were there, the mother. And Chris had a baby or a panda bear, stuffed panda bear with the baby panda bear in its arms. And she handed it to us and said, "This is for your daughter." And we had a wonderful meal. We all talked. The 50-year-old was very bright and engaged and fun. And when the meal was over, we drove out to the house. The baby had actually been taken out of the hospital and placed with a foster mother. And so we drove to the foster mother's place at Clancy, Montana. And we all took pictures together with the baby and with the birth mother. And to my knowledge, in an agency adoption in Montana, there were only about 3 agencies operating in Montana. That was probably the first time that parents would have met the birth mother. And so we met and we parted, and we took Andrea, our daughter, up to my parents' house in Helena. We stayed overnight. And so what happened was, Chris went back to the Florence Crittenden home, and she told all the other mothers, "You should see what I did." And they all heard that this was, in fact, the tipping point. It was the first time a mother had realized the ungodly negotiating power they have, because the agencies, for very good reasons, and and their hearts were in the right places, they kept this all secret, but they didn't, I don't think, appreciate the fact that a mother had the negotiating power of withholding the baby. And this was the start of a change. Mothers started demanding that they place the baby, or that it started demanding rights in placing the baby, even picking the parents, which was absolutely forbidden. And so we took Andrea home, and there were some legal procedures. They had some hangups because the mother was not able to identify the father, but we adopted her at 1 year. And then when she was 1 year old, Becky contacted me with a note and said she would like to get together. And she just gave us the note, and the note was handwritten in pen or pencil. And it said, "I was just wondering on the baby's first birthday, if it would be possible if we could get together and meet. And then I won't need to see her again. I just want to make sure everything's okay." And she said, "I understand if we can't do this, but I hope we can." And the social worker showed us that, and across the bottom in great big letters, she'd written, "Please." And I said to the social worker, "How would we say no to this?" So we got together with her at Chaudère, the Children's Hospital in Helena. And we had a wonderful meeting, and it was fun talking to her. She brought a boyfriend with her, and I saw that the car licenses it was on a Saturday, the only car parked in front was from Anaconda. So I knew at that point, and by the way, we didn't know each other's names. We didn't know what cities we lived in or anything like that. But I gleaned then that she was from Anaconda. And after that meeting, we made an agreement that with her that we wouldn't meet again until our daughter was old enough to start asking questions, and that when she was old enough to ask questions and wanted to meet her birth mother, we would contact the agency and go back and do that. And so that, I think, again, was a first. It was us making an agreement that we would keep contact with his birth mother. And so when Andrew was about 5 years old, she started asking all the questions that are asked. And I'm looking at the time here to make. She started asking the questions that were asked. And she finally came to the ultimate question after many days. She said, well, where is my birth mother and can I meet her? And we said, yes. So we met with Christine. And from that point on, our daughter, and we had an open adoption on the second one too, because this spread very quickly. And from that point on, we kept in touch with the birth mothers. By the time our daughters were 9 years old, it was out of our hands. They and their birth mothers made the decisions when they were going to get together, if they were going to get together for birthdays and things like that. And that's an up and down thing. The birth mothers had lots of problems. And at this point in our lives, our daughters are both adults and they both have children. And I think they both now don't have contact with their birth mothers because their birth mothers had significant problems. And they've chosen not to have them in their lives with their children. But that was the event. It was a remarkable event and very, very emotional for us. And it's been unbelievably rewarding to have met the birth mothers. We have not met birth fathers for various reasons. One, Andrea's birth father cannot be located. And the other one has been in such severe problems that we don't think it's viable to meet with them. But for us to have met the birth mothers and know the birth mothers, and we can see a roadmap for what our daughters are like, and we can see things that we shouldn't be alarmed about, and maybe things we should be concerned about, has been very valuable. And I think it's wonderful. And our children have, I think, a much greater sense of who they are and where they came from, which is a very healthy thing. So the change that's taken place is if you go to any of the mainstream adoption agencies in Montana now, and you apply for a baby, you will have to agree to meet the birth parents and agree to some kind of an ongoing communication with them. And if you don't do that, you go to the bottom of the pile as far as adoption. So that was a huge change, a huge connecting change in our lives. And I love telling this story. I get all emotional every time I do tell it. But as you all know, children are the greatest point of your life, and it has been for us. And Mark, God knows what I forgot in here, but thank you.
You did great, Greg. Thank you so much for jumping in there at the last second. I'm so grateful to you. Our next storyteller is Molly Bradford, and she is the CEO and co-founder at Gatherboard, the makers of MissoulaEvents.net. Molly is an active member of the Missoula startup ecosystem and is so excited to introduce to the world Cheddarboard early 2021. You can hear all about that. We just had a little interview, and you can listen to that at the tellussomething.org website. We talked a lot about Cheddarboard and what that's going to look like. She loves to put mass quantities of food on storage for the winter and race her husband and kids down the slopes, and makes telecommuting from Mexico a family priority when she can. Please welcome Molly Bradford.
Hi, I hope you guys can hear me. Mark, will you just give me a little beep, beep, beep if you can't, because I'm on my Bluetooth. Thanks. My kids are doing remote school in a different room, and I have the door closed, like, don't open it unless someone's bleeding. So thank you. I'm pretty nervous to tell this off the cuff, so pardon my foibles, and I'm gonna set myself a 10-minute timer really quickly. I thought I had that, but I didn't. Okay. 7 years ago, I shot a doe on opening day. I was leaning into a cool sandy bank moments before, watching the sun come over the top towards the Bitterroot Mountains. And I only had about 45 minutes of hunting hours left. The sun looked like it would set in maybe about 15 or 20 minutes. I knew with detailed certainty that a herd of deer were going to leave the forest and come into the field. I was at a friend's farm south of Hamilton, up the Bitterroot. I had been given this gift of an opening day new mom's hunt. And as I leaned into the bank, my breasts engorged and my breast pump just a few 100 yards away in the truck, my pocket vibrated. I looked at the phone. It was my husband, Spencer, texting me. How's it going? Great, I thought, until now. Will's crying and he won't take a bottle. You see, earlier that morning, I woke up for a sunrise hunt with my hunting partner, Taylor. But I woke up just before my alarm to the sound of a barking seal coming from the other room. This was not a seal. This was my baby, William. He was 6 months old at the time and struggling to breathe. This would be his first of what would be nearly 20 bouts of croup over the first couple years of his life. I ran into his room and was luckily able to quickly stabilize his breathing. At this point, once William was calmed down, and I was a little bit as well, I thought to myself, as the dread set in, do I have to cancel my hunt? Do I have to cancel on Taylor? What about my time away? Is it fair for me to leave Will with Spencer and EB? How is this going to work out? I texted Taylor and told her what was going on. Spencer and I talked, and we decided that if it was okay with the landowner, I would come back for an evening hunt with Taylor. This hunt was a gimme. The landowner was giving Taylor and I, as young moms, a gift. So we decided that it would be a go that afternoon. Taylor had taught me to hunt when EB was a baby, and we were a group of mostly women and young moms who had often shared fruits and vegetables and swapped recipes for years, even had birthing classes together. We wanted a similar relationship with our meat as we had with other parts of our lives and our dinner table. So with the hunt back on, here I was leaning into the bank. There had been sign everywhere. I'd walked across a well-trodden game path. I'd seen scat on the ground, scuff marks on fallen logs and scratch marks. I knew I was in the right spot, and I laid there long enough for the forest to quiet. The squirrels were no longer chattering, giving away my position in the forest. I could hear the wings of the raven over my head before I could even see it. And then, like they sometimes do, the deer appeared before me where they weren't a moment before. The hairs went up. The hairs just went up on my arm. The hairs went up on the back of my neck, and I watched as the scout ran out, looking over its shoulder, and then a few does came out in a buck. This was not one of the trophy bucks, but I also wasn't hunting for a trophy. I was hunting for meat. This wasn't about ego. This was about my freezer and my family. And so I leaned into my scope and leaned into the bank and steadied my breathing. And I took those breaths, those final breaths, in the push before you bring life into the world, and the pull of the trigger before you take a life. It was a great shot on all accounts. The deer scattered, and the doe just stumbled back a few yards and fell in the first area of the forest. It turns out I shot it through the heart. I quickly texted Taylor, the landowner, and my husband, letting everyone know what was going on, because now is when the work really begins. I approached the animal and prepared to field dress it. I had prepared for this hunt like you prepare for having a child. nutrition, exercise, you pack your bag, you have the right clothes, you're ready. I laid out the parts from my backpack, my field dressing kit, my snacks. I set my rifle down. I didn't have any gloves. I had baby wipes, but no gloves. And I'd forgotten a headlamp because it was supposed to be a morning hunt. It was getting dark quickly and I was getting cold, and I started to dress the animal. And as I made the incision down the front of the animal, I came to a swollen abdomen. This was a nursing doe. I shot a nursing doe on opening day. I couldn't go back. And as I sliced through the milk sacs and the milk spilled into the wound and onto my hands, my own milk spilled into my camo. What was quickly going to become a bad adrenaline trip was steadied by Taylor, my hunting partner. She came over and talked me down, stabilized the animal, and I finished a very sloppy and quick field dressing. We drug the animal back to the truck, stumbling in the dark, neither one of us with headlamps. Got it into the back of the truck and set our thanks at the farm and headed home. I dropped Taylor off at her mom's halfway up the Bitterroot on the way home, and we saw some other friends who'd been fishing for the day. We swapped stories and high fives, but I couldn't shake my sorrow. Taylor and I had convinced ourselves in the woods that the doe would be fine. Some other mom would nurse it. My friends told me the same thing again. I got home just weary and tired and a little sad. William was eager to see me. He nursed and we fell asleep into fitful sleep. The next morning, Evie bounded out into the back of the truck and checked out the deer. And did you bring the heart home for me, Mama? I did. I always bring home the heart. She played with it, squeezing it around, pushing water in and out of the ventricles. We would cook it later for dinner. We pulled out the back straps, and then William and I took the deer to the butcher. Some years I have the bandwidth to do my own butchering, and this was not one of those years. At the butcher, I brought stuff in, and he was so excited to have me there from an opening day hunt. He was about to be interviewed by the local news, and he loved talking about his women hunters that succeed on opening day. His line, not mine, they hunt with more finesse and less ego. And I was like, well, that worked this time for me, but I was still a little sad. And then his lead processor came out from the back, and I started to tell them about the doe and the fawn and the milk and William, and I started tearing up at the butcher. And the processor put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "It's okay, Mama. You did nothing wrong. You provided a meal in the forest for other animals and for your family. And this doe needed to wean so that it could survive the winter. You're okay." And in that moment, I felt fairly absolved from my suffering. I headed home with the baby. Spencer prepared backstrap for dinner. Evie was excited to get the heart ready to make fritters. And I gently rocked back and forth in the kitchen, nursing William, embraced and soothed by the push and the pull of the rhythm of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. All right. Our next storyteller makes me remember that often I'll get the question from audience members or potential audience members, can I bring my kids to tell us something? And what I tell them always is, I've seen 12-year-olds, I've seen 9-year-olds that tell us something. I don't know anything about your kids. I don't know what their emotional development level is. There are adult themes and adult language at Tell Us Something. We don't have gratuitous violence or gratuitous language, but there sometimes can be profanity. And I bring this up because our next story does include some profanity. Chris Latre is our next storyteller, and I'm going to share my screen and we'll play the story for you. I introduce him from the stage, so I won't reintroduce him here. His father wants nothing to do with his Native American heritage, and Chris, as he becomes an adult, begins exploring this heritage, seeking understanding of who he is and where he comes from. Chris calls his story "How's It Going, Chief?" And his story was recorded October 2nd, 2018, to a sold-out crowd at the Wilma. The theme that night was "It's Complicated." Brett, can you please let me share the screen? His freelance writing. Drive of Chippewa Indians. Please welcome Chris Latre. His freelance writing of Sorry, y'all. I think I just figured out what was happening. So we're going to try it again.
Chris Latre is a writer, a walker, and a photographer. His freelance writing and/or photography has appeared in various regional and national publications. His first book, One Sentence Journal, Short Poems and Essays from the World at Large, was recently released via Riverfeet Press. Chris Latre is Chippewa Cree Métis and is an enrolled member of the Little Shell Tribe of Chippewa Indians. Please welcome Chris Latre.
Thanks, Mark. Did someone just wolf whistle? I could have sworn I heard one. So there's a story in my family about my father. This is late 60s, early 70s, I'm not sure what year. Out at the mill in Frenchtown. He's fresh out of the Navy, few years. And he's leaning on a rail in the mill proper. The guy walks up to him. It's kind of an apocryphal story, so you don't necessarily know what's true and what isn't. But when my dad would tell me, it's his foreman. He walks up on me, slaps him on the back, and he says, "How's it going, Chief?" Which for my dad was the only match you needed to light for the gasoline of rage that fueled him. And he chased this guy from one end of the mill to the other before he finally caught him. And when my dad would tell me the story, he said, "I grabbed that son of a bitch by the throat and I said, 'Don't you ever fucking talk to me again.'" And he swears that he never did. And I've heard that story from my dad. I heard it from my sister who worked there for a while. I heard it from a couple other people. The reason my dad was so angry is he was Indian and he hated the fact that he was Indian. And calling an Indian chief is something like calling an Indian squaw or naming a football team Redskins. You don't know what it means unless you live it. And my dad lived it. And to wonder how and why he felt that way, you have to kind of do a certain amount of speculation because he never talked about it until the day he died. And as Mark announced, I am enrolled with the Little Shell tribe of Montana. And when my dad died on October 30th, 2014, I don't know if he ever even heard of the Little Shell tribe. It's only through investigation of my own that I've learned our family lineage. And if he knew it, he never talked about it. My grandparents would talk about it, that we were Indians. They said we were Chippewa. But when they died, I don't necessarily know if they knew about the Little Shell. So who are the Little Shell? Well, the Little Shell tribe is a part named after a specific band led by a chief named Little Shell, who broke away as a result of the 1892 Macomber Commission. So we are a people, a part of the larger Pembina tribe of Indians that live kind of in what we would call the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes, Canada. We're talking the Anishinaabe, Ojibwa, Chippewa. Like a horse or a dog, I have papers. My papers say I'm Chippewa Cree Métis. But the Little Shell in 1892, the Macomber Commission, they came to that part of the country and saw all this land that the Indians had, and they said, "We want it. We're going to pay you fair market value," which was like $1 an acre. And the result of that was the creation of the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota. Little Shell said, "Nah, we're not interested." And the Fed said, "Well, if you guys don't sign on to this and go on the reservation, we're going to say that you essentially don't exist," which is true. We're a not federally recognized tribe. Little Shell said, "You know what? We don't recognize your borders. We don't recognize your laws, so we're just not going to play. We don't care what you say about our existence because we know who we are." Which to me, I love the fact that part of my lineage goes all the way back to just a big fuck you to the man. And I wish my dad knew about that. So I try and understand, the downside of that is that my grandparents' generation could be deported to Canada as Métis people. So they didn't want people to know they were Indian. Think about, we're only a couple generations removed from Native children being removed from their families so that they didn't learn their language and sent to these boarding schools. I don't know my language, which is not a surprise because I didn't know up until about a decade ago who I was. So you can understand why people like my father and the generation before him would try and keep it on the down low exactly what and where they came from. But we don't have a reservation. We have small concentrated communities in towns like Great Falls and Lewistown and places like that. But my dad never talked about it, and I like to think about what it was like for him growing up in the 50s in towns like Anaconda and Hamilton, and what it was like with no community to be a part of, being called, Indian or half-breed, which is what the derogatory term for what the Métis people are, or prairie nigger, things like that. What was it like to grow up that way with nobody to back you up? And your father is an alcoholic and he beats you. Who would own that you were Indian? Who is your community at that point? Your community becomes your rage and your ability to fight. And that's what my dad learned. He learned to drink probably by the time he was 13. The only thing that saved him was the Navy. And he came out of the Navy reinventing himself as someone who would only claim to be white. My grandparents would talk about us being Chippewa, and he would say, "Oh, that's bullshit." So you understand why, as a racist, probably the people he hated the most were Indians. And I grew up wondering who we are and where we came from. But at the same time, I've learned some of that rage for different reasons. I learned my rage because everybody made fun of me for being fat. I don't recall being, hassled about being Indian, but it could have happened. People made comments here and there. So none of this sounds particularly complicated to me. I mean, it's easy for me to look at the colonial nature of the United States and be full of rage at times. And I don't let it get to the best of me. I have my coping mechanisms. I meditate. I practice yoga. I walk in the woods. I try and be this earthy dude with greater levels of success from time to time. What's complicated about it is that I'm as white as any white person in this room as well. And that comes from my mother's family. And the fact that I don't drink and that I have a greater capacity to love than fight, the kind of advice my dad would give me was, if you ever get in a fight with somebody, you gotta hurt them. You gotta hurt them so bad that they know never to fuck with you again. Well, I've fortunately never been in a fight in my life, and I intend to keep it that way. And I credit the fact that my mother has been the largest influence in my life, and her mother. I didn't know my paternal grandparents hardly at all. But my maternal grandmother was a big part of my life. She was a big sports fan. When Ted Turner created the Superstation, we used to watch Atlanta Braves baseball. She took me to Grizzly basketball games. I remember one time, this is the 70s, Michael Ray Richardson. Does anybody here remember Michael Ray Richardson? He was a legitimate NBA superstar coming out of the Montana Grizzlies basketball program until he got a little caught up in drugs and got kicked out of the league and had to go to Europe. But my grandmother, and I have this vivid memory of them playing Gonzaga, and Sugar Ray Richardson lights them up for 40 points. And every time a foul gets called on the Grizzlies, the Grizz fans are like, bullshit, bullshit. And my grandma's over there just, because that's how she was. She loved stuff like that. But I have another vivid memory of my grandmother walking into her kitchen wearing a T-shirt that I was so proud of. I was a huge Kiss fan. And Paul Stanley with a solo album picture that's purple. And Paul Stanley, like, "Hey, Mom," she didn't want us to call her grandma. We called her Mom. "Mom, look at my shirt." And she's like, "Oh, honey. Oh, honey." So that was my grandma. And my mom is probably here tonight. She's been, when my rock band used to play in Seattle, she would drive over to watch us play. She comes to everything I do. She's been my biggest fan. So that's the complicated part. Yeah, give it up for my mom. Thank you. Thank you. That's the complicated part. I'm every bit as much a white European Czech Dane as I am a raging Indian who wants to drive everybody off the continent. And that's the complicated part of what we're trying to face in the world, and this country in particular at large, is how the hell do we get along with each other when we can hardly get along with ourselves? So, I mean, this isn't a story with an arc and a big kicker, funny ending, but I feel like if I can just deal with all my raging bullshit and still show up for work on time and be nice to people and yeah, if I can do it, you can do it. So thank you. Thank you.
Oh, Crystal Trey. He's working on a new book, and go say hi to him at Fact and Fiction and buy your books at your local bookstore. Support your local bookstore. Thanks, Crystal Trey. Our next storyteller is Patrick Shea, and he joins us live to share his story. I worked with him last week for a while to help him shape his story, and this is the first time that he's told it publicly, and I'm really excited to hear how it's come along. Patrick, you need to unmute yourself. And
yeah, thanks, Mark.
Yeah, please welcome Patrick O'Shea. Oh, excuse me, Patrick Shea.
The O works too. That's great. So when I was a senior in college, two of my closest friends and I made plans to ride our bikes from northern Wisconsin, where we lived, to Newfoundland, Canada. There was a tradition at the small college I went to where after the graduation ceremony, the whole class in their caps and gowns would ride their bikes down to Lake Superior, which was a short distance from campus. And Simon and Hal and I, my riding partners, had planned to join the class in the ride to the lake, but then we would keep going with our camping stuff. Loaded up, we'd head east across Michigan's Upper Peninsula, cross into Canada at Sault Ste. Marie, follow the Great Lakes to the St. Lawrence Seaway, take that to the ocean and take a ferry to the island of Newfoundland. We wanted to make it to the easternmost point in North America. That was kind of our goal, and we'd been saving for this trip for a couple years, and we kind of framed it around connections, the connectivity of the Great Lakes. We all grew up in the Great Lakes states and knew that all these bodies of water were connected, but hadn't seen how, and we wanted to see it ourselves. So we set out, and we also formed strong connections with one another along the way. I was already good friends with Simon and Hal, but there's a special bond that forms on tour. It's a really unique blend, I'd say, of like solitude and camaraderie, because you can be riding by yourself. You might even lose sight of your riding partner over the next hill, but you know you're going to be sharing beers with them around the campfire later. And that dependability of your friends in those situations, we became very close. But what I want to talk about today is actually when making connections got really hard along the way because of a language barrier, which is something that I foolishly hadn't anticipated, even though I'd spent my whole senior year of college meticulously planning this route. And I knew we'd be going through Quebec, but I hadn't thought about the language barrier. And a lot of English speaking people who I think maybe have never even been there told me like, oh, they speak English, you know, they just won't. They'll be a little rude at first, but they'll speak English to you. It's just like really narrow-minded now when I look back on it, because the reality I found was that in a lot of rural Quebec, people were very, very friendly and outgoing, but they didn't speak any more English than I did French, which is none at all. I have some background in Spanish from high school, but something about the French language just phonetically doesn't click with me. And people would see us come through town with all our bags and loaded on our bikes, and they'd ask us where we were going, I think, or they'd approach us and be friendly and ask a question in French. And I'd say, I'm sorry, I don't speak French. And they'd say some more words in French a little slower, but it didn't really help. But I was enjoying it. I have not traveled much internationally. I've sort of had my head buried in the sand of the Anglosphere. And it was really cool to me to not speak the language for a while. I couldn't read the signs. I was kind of just at the mercy of the kindness of strangers, which was working out great. And the other exciting thing was it was extremely beautiful. We were biking along the Seaway, and as we went north, the water got wider and wider, and mountains on either side on a still day were reflected on the water. And it was just breathtakingly gorgeous and so different and new. And we'd been camping all along the way, and sometimes using a website called warmshowers.org, which if you're ever thinking of bike touring is a great resource where people put their contact information online and say the town they live in. And then if you're going to be riding through, you can reach out to them and see if you might find a place to shower and do laundry and whatever else. So we were approaching the town of Three Rivers, but it's called Three Rivers in French. And we found someone on Warm Showers and had messaged them. They said they weren't in the area right now, but told us where their cabin is outside of town and told us where they hid the key and said we could stay there for the night. And we were blown away. That was so kind. And we said thank you and headed for the cabin with a 30 rack of Labatt Blue, which in Quebec is spelled B-L-E-U, which we really got a kick out of. And that night we spent out of the bugs for a night, enjoyed that rarity, and drank our Labatt's and played cards and reminisced about our college years that had just ended and about the trip so far, and just kind of daydreamed about what the rest of the ride might be like. And we laughed and sang and had a great night. One of the best nights of the trip. I went to sleep that night on that cabin floor with a big smile on my face, like it was Christmas Eve or something, just hard to get to sleep because I was so excited. And I woke up the next morning though, and my throat was on fire, just hurt so bad. And my first thought was, oh, we drank too many Labatt's last night. I need to drink some water. I'm probably exhausted and dehydrated. So I start chugging water, and I find that swallowing is difficult and very painful. And I get this sinking feeling that's like, this is what the next 2 months is going to be like for me, or something. You know, the next 200 miles, because we were stubbornly determined to get there. Simon had been sick like a week earlier, and we just rode on and on. And there's not a lot of chance for your body to recover and heal when you're riding 50 to 70 miles a day, fully loaded, and drinking beer every night. It's not a great recovery system. So I just accepted it. I was like, this is what the ride's going to be like. I got to push through this. And I tried not to complain too much and tried to keep my chin up and keep pedaling. But about 4 days went by, and it was only getting worse. And I was starting to get worried about how hard it was to swallow. And I was in a strange place and didn't know how to get medical help necessarily. And we were biking through towns called like Des Ormeaux and Bécancour and Deschâlons, Sources-Saint-Laurent. These are literally my best attempts at saying the names. I'm not trying to be offensive. We went through a town called St. Louis du Ha Ha, like the town St. Louis, then the word DU, then ha ha with an exclamation mark between each ha. And we were like, how do you possibly say this? I would have thought it was even funnier if I wasn't in such a bad place with my throat. After about 40 miles into a day, we rode into a small town, and it was cold and raining. And I thought, this is not going to help me get better. And I splurged, and we got a cheap hotel room for the night. And Hal is kind of the team chef, and he said, I'm going to make you a really strong like ginger and garlic soup, and it's going to heal your throat, and we're going to get up and feel great and keep pressing on to Newfoundland. We got to get there. The easternmost point in North America, you know, we got to keep pedaling. So I just put my trust in that. I was like, I'm so grateful for my friends willing to stop for the day and take care of me, and I'm going to wake up tomorrow and feel great. But I didn't. I woke up and it was worse than ever. And I didn't have a say in the matter anymore. I was like, this is dangerous. I need to find an antibiotic medicine. I thought I had some kind of infection. So I got on Google Translate, and I wrote out my situation in English and had Google translate it to French. And I said, my name's Patrick. I'm biking from Wisconsin. We've been on the road for a month and a half. My throat hurts. It's getting hard to swallow, and I'm worried. I don't want to go home. We want to finish our trip to Newfoundland. I need medicine. And I hand wrote the translation that came in French. I hand wrote it in pen and put all the little apostrophes right where they went. And I had no idea how accurate the translation was. And biked around this little town, and I saw there was a doctor's office and a couple pharmacies. But first I went to the pharmacy because I knew how long doctors could take. I thought, maybe the pharmacy, maybe they're a cool pharmacy, socialized medicine or whatever. Maybe they'll just slip me a prescription under the table for an antibiotic and we'll get on our way. It didn't work like that. But I went in up to the desk and said bonjour, and they said bonjour, and I handed them the note, and they read it, and a smirk kind of went across their face, and they chuckled a little, but then stopped when they saw how serious it was. And they said I needed to get a prescription from a doctor, and said to go across to the doctor's office. So I biked over to the doctor's. They're all booked up with appointments. There's no way they can see me today. They said I'd have to go to a hospital, but there was one more pharmacy in town, and I thought maybe this one would be cool. It was a last ditch effort. The closest hospital was in a town called Montagny, and I wasn't going to make it there. It was 65 miles, and that just did not sound good. So I went to the other pharmacy. They told me the same thing. They read the note. They laughed. They said they couldn't help me. And I walked back outside thinking, is this the end of the road for me? Am I going to have to go home? What does this mean? And I see a cop car sitting outside the pharmacy. And I am not the type of person to usually walk right up to a cop car and ask for help. And also I looked terrible. I hadn't shaved in months. I smelled really bad. I'm sure I was covered in like chain grease and sweat. And from what I'd seen of Quebec, I thought it might be illegal to look that bad in Quebec. Everyone was really beautiful, including this cop, which only made me more nervous. I walked up to her window of her car and she rolled it down, and I handed her the handwritten note, she started reading it and burst out laughing, and then caught herself really quick and acted serious. And laughter is universal. I picked up on that. She was really trying to catch herself. Next thing I know, she's talking in the radio in French, and the person on the other line of the radio is talking back also in French. And I'm standing there thinking, am I about to get helped out or arrested? I really didn't know. And she stepped out of the car and opened the back door of the cop car and started motioning for me to like put my things in the back. And basically she said she'd give me a ride to the hospital. I took apart my bike, broke down the wheels, shoved it all in there. The chain ring was probably scraping up her back seat. It was all pressed up against the windows, and I couldn't believe she was doing this for me. And I called my friends and told them, meet me in Montag and me. I'll be there at the hospital. And she drove me the 60-some miles to town, and we're driving on the highway along the seaway looking out. Long, awkward silences. And all I could keep saying was, it's so beautiful, because it was. And she would say, we, beautiful. And we did that 3 or 4 times, and that was the whole conversation. And she dropped me off at the hospital, and I went in. They kind of scrambled to find the one nurse who was fluent in English. It didn't really seem like they'd had a lot of international patients there, so we had to figure out the insurance and everything, but we did, and I was able to get an antibiotic. I camped out on my own that night, just feeling really grateful for the kindness of this cop who helped me and the kindness of everyone along the way for reading my note and bearing with me. And I felt better the next morning. I took this antibiotic. I already felt better, increasingly got better. We did make it to Newfoundland. We stood together at the easternmost point, looking out across the North Atlantic Ocean. And we wouldn't have made it if it weren't for the connections people tried to make with me despite the language barrier, and for the kindness and generosity of strangers. So this is my first time doing one of these. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Patrick. You did great. Next time you'll do it from the stage. Thank you to all of our storytellers, Greg Monroe and Molly Bradford, your heroes for doing that live and helping us overcome those technical difficulties. Thanks to Chris Latre. He can't be here today. He sends his regards. He's hard at work at Fact and Fiction. And thanks, Patrick. Susan, do you want to take it?
Thank you all. Especially, I have to say, Molly and Greg, for Grace Under Pressure. I read this quote the other day when I was thinking about this forum, was on my mind, and I read this quote that said, communication is an exchange of information, but connection is an exchange of humanity. And I feel like you all shared your humanity with us today in a really lovely way. And we're grateful. I don't know if people have questions, but we have storytellers here willing to answer them if you want to put something in the Q&A. And if not, we'll wait for a second. And if there are no questions, we will just...
Can I say something, Susan?
Absolutely.
You know, I wasn't sure how this was going to come together today, and you know, Tell Us Something. Most people who know what Tell Us Something is know that we have every event is based on a theme, and the themes are usually by design really broad, so that they can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. And I was a little concerned that the theme of connection was too specific. And I didn't curate these stories today. You all did, and I'm grateful the way that you did it, because each one of these stories does really talk about connection, but in a very different way. You know, Greg talks about the story, the connection of a young mother she has to her child, and the responsibility that she still feels even though she's giving her child up. The connection that he has, you know, among his family was so different than Molly's story. The connection that she has with nature, the connection that she wants to have with her food sources, the connection she has with her family. And then we get to Chris, and he talks about how connection can be something like this. The connection to ourselves we have two different things battling against each other amongst ourselves. And it was cool the way it all came together. And Patrick's story, Patrick, you did a great job pulling this together, because as of last week at this time, Patrick wasn't sure what story he was going to tell. So He pulled it off really well. I'm proud of all of the storytellers today, and thank you for the opportunity, Susan.
Sure. We do have a question about, Mark, from somebody who wants to, my friend Chris at the Montana World Affairs Council, who wants to find out how to sign up as a storyteller.
So I'm not sure when the next Tell Us Something event is going to be because of COVID, but I can tell you the way it used to work. I would announce a theme, and that goes out in an email blast on the Tell Us Something website and through social media. And then people have a number to call. It's a Google Voice number, 406-203-4683. And they pitch their story. Generally, we have 8 storytellers, and we would get between 18 and 25 people pitching to want to basically audition to be a storyteller at Tell Us Something. So the pitch goes into a Dropbox file. It's an MP3 file. And I've got an advisory board, and we all sit and we listen to the stories, and there's a Google spreadsheet, and we say, Susan, hey, Patrick, she's in. Juanita Vero, nope, she's not gonna, she's already done it before. So we'll give preference to people who have never done it. And, so then we distill it down, and sometimes I have to fight for the storytellers that I want. I've pitched before. I've pitched my story and not been selected by my own board. So it happens. And right now, I told you that I've been doing storytelling workshops over Zoom, and I've been trying to sort of keep a list of people from those workshops who might be good at this when we are able to do a live event again. The streaming events, I think people are getting a little burnt out on Zoom. The very first Tell Us Something streaming event we did, we had 825 people show up, concurrent viewers. And the last one we did, I think we had 120 people show up. And so it's so unpredictable, and it's hard to tell a story in this way, because part of the biggest part of, I think, a Tell Us Something event is the connection that happens in the room with the audience and the storyteller. I mean, even though the listeners aren't actively talking back to the storyteller, there is a dialogue that's going on.
Right. And there's that energy of the live audience. So.
Such great energy. It's incredible. So I'm not sure when the next storytelling intensive workshop is, but if you have a story that you want to work on, every Saturday I've got a drop-in Zoom workshop at 10:30. It's 90 minutes long. So if you've got a story that you want to workshop, Saturday mornings, get your cup of coffee and join whoever ends up coming. You don't have to come to every one. You can come to just one, or you can come to all of them. But I'm going to be doing that every Saturday through April. So that might be a way that I start to recruit storytellers as well. Good question.
I think something else. Brett, I know you're looking at the chat. Oh, my quote about communication and connection. Yeah, of course, I can't remember who said it, but it said communication is an exchange of information and connection is an exchange of humanity. And it just jumped out at me because of this forum. And we're getting some thanks in the chat. I will just thank you, Mark. Thank you, storytellers. Thank you, our audience.
We do have a question that came through. Not trying to interrupt you.
Yeah, no.
One of the participants asked, what makes for a good story? Yeah, and I think we all know a good story when we hear it, but there are certain ways that you can improve your storytelling. And there's always going to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you just tell us what those things are, that's not really a story. So we want some action and then a little bit of reflection. How are you feeling about it? What are you worried about? What's going to happen next? Then give us some action. Anticipate what is it going to be? All these different possibilities, and then what actually happens. How did you feel about it? How did other people respond to it? A good story the storyteller has something to gain or lose. And I feel like I said this at the very first time I was ever interviewed. During the course of the story, you have to either gain or lose that thing. And now, especially, we have such short attention spans. The opening line is really important, and you have to grab the listener from the beginning. And I like to start in the action. In this format, it's so hard to do, but often I'll start the story right in the middle of what's happening, and then I like to do flashbacks myself. Everyone has a different style of telling stories, and so it's fun to watch how different people approach it. There is a very well-known national storytelling group called The Moth. A lot of people know it. And I like to make the joke that we could turn it into a drinking game as soon as somebody says at that moment, because almost every single Moth story, you'll hear that phrase. And the reason for it is because good stories, the storyteller is changed in some way. Whatever the experiences are that are happening in the story, transform the storyteller as well as the listener. But if the storyteller doesn't change and it's more of like a bragging or an anecdote, I don't think it works as well. So I hope that answers the question.
Great. That's like a free Zoom workshop right there. Thank you.
Yeah.
I will resume my thank yous to our sponsors, especially our lead sponsors, University of Montana, First Security Bank, and Blackfoot. As always, to Alex Karklins, our Wizard of Oz behind the scenes. Please join us on January 11 via Zoom for a forum titled Adventures in the Wild, What Nature Can Teach Us, featuring wildlife ecology professor Dave Noggle, writer and ecosystem observer Doug Chadwick, who wrote The Wolverine Way, among other books, and Regents Professor Jackie Moore, an expert in business innovations inspired by biomimicry. All three talking about what we can learn from nature. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and have a great holiday. Bye.
Thank you.